This is Joe narrating a PowerPoint from page 520 in the Kaplan book, Lesson 7, Life Science, Evolution and Natural Selection. The key ideas are that Charles Darwin is considered the father of evolution because he developed a theory as to why things looked similar yet different. He supposed that organisms are selected for by nature, and adaptations or physical traits that give certain animals advantages will be passed on to their offspring, and these physical appearances will become more common in the next generation. Over time, organisms, even though derived from the same species originally, will begin to look different. Charles Darwin wrote a famous book called The Origin of Species, which was published in 1859. Charles Darwin noticed that breeders could breed for different traits in dogs. For example, dogs make up one species but have vastly different appearances based on the breed of dog that is bred for. For example, you can have small dogs that are used for hunting small animals in small holes, or you can have large dogs that are used for protection, or hunting dogs with different characteristics that are useful for hunting. These traits were selected by humans who created artificial breeding patterns in these dogs so that they can get the traits that they want. In nature, the struggle for existence within nature selects for different traits. For example, a cheetah is a very fast type of cat in Africa. Cheetahs that are faster, maybe have longer legs, will capture more food. These animals will live longer, they'll reproduce more often, they'll pass these traits on to their offspring so that their offspring will also be faster or have longer legs. So favorable traits which favor life and reproduction are passed on to the next generation. When Charles Darwin was 21 years old, he went on a 5-year voyage around the world as the ship's naturalist. One of the stops was at the Galapagos Islands, which is a group of islands of volcanic origin about 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador, right on the equator. On these islands, Darwin noticed that there were different types of finches, a bird, on these different islands, and they had different appearances depending on which island he found them. So he collected these birds and brought them back to England for further study. He turned them over to a bird expert, and the bird expert said that these are not different species of birds or different families of birds, but all finch type birds, and he suggested that they were similar and maybe derived from a single population of finches, maybe one that was very similar to one on the mainland of South America. So the theory was that a single pregnant bird or a pair of birds got blown in a storm from the mainland of South America, 600 miles west to the Galapagos. These birds or bird landed on an island, established a colony, and because the environment on the Galapagos was slightly different than the mainland, they would develop different traits over time. Another set of birds might be blown to one of the other islands in the Galapagos, and because of the slightly different environment and the isolation in reproductive choices, the birds on the other island would begin to look slightly different as well. So over time, the birds on different islands begin to look different and may even become different species, which means that birds from different islands cannot interbreed with each other and create fertile offspring. So Darwin's theory was that evolution required variation, which is just differences in the appearance of organisms within a species. Some are tall, some are short, some are fast, some are slow. These traits that varied had to be inherited. So the ability to run fast was handed from the parents to the offspring through the genes. There was selection in nature such that Animals that were faster, for example, were able to hunt more food, were able to survive, reproduce, and have more offspring. These offspring would have characteristics like the parents, like the faster speed. Animals that were slower tended not to survive in the wild and tended not to pass on their slow traits to the next generation. This form of evolution required a very long time. In Darwin's day in the 19th century, many people thought that the Earth was only 6,000 years old, but in Darwin's day there were other scientists like Darwin himself who felt that the Earth was many millions of years old, which will allow enough time for this evolutionary process to take place. All of these requirements, variation, inheritance, selection, and time, accounted for the different appearances of organisms, and traits that allowed an organism to do very well in its environment were called adaptations. For example, the long neck of the giraffe was an adaptation that allowed giraffes to eat further up in the tree so that it would survive and pass on the long neck genes to its offspring. Darwin made a very small tree of life in one of his notebooks, but this tree of life has been extended so that we now think that bacteria and animals and plants all had a common ancestor billions of years ago. And this process of evolution as described by Darwin accounted for the different appearances of animals and organisms that are living today. For example, on the right-hand side, you can see that animals share a common ancestor with mushrooms or fungi, which share a common ancestor with plants, and then it goes backwards in time. Just looking at our local branch of the tree of life, looking at primates, which are a grouping within mammals, we see that humans on the right shared a common ancestor with chimpanzees about 6 million years ago. That common ancestor of humans and chimps shared a common ancestor with gorillas about 10 million years ago. And you can trace this back so that the living species of today, like chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, gibbons, they look different than us because we had a common ancestor longer and longer time ago, depending on how far back we go. For example, chimpanzees are more like humans than gorillas because we had a more recent common ancestor. If you look at the DNA of a chimpanzee, it bears that out. The DNA of a chimpanzee is more similar to human DNA than is the DNA of a gorilla. So that's it for evolution, page 520 in the Kaplan book.